I get the smell of this stuff. The water is leaking out.
Chairman Dr. Sen, distinguished speaker Professor Chetty, invited guests and colleagues. We are indeed very happy that Professor Chetty has accepted our invitation to give this lecture on growth and distribution. Professor Chetty is a research professor at the Boston University, and earlier he had taught at Columbia and the Indian Statistical Institute. He has worked in several fields: monetary economics, production theory, rationing issues, and also medical decision-making rules. In most of his work, he basically, he's fond of focusing on how various agents or decision makers in the economy, how do they take decisions, what do they respond to, and how do we reach some kind of equilibrium. These are some of the themes on which he used to teach quite a bit at the Indian Statistical Institute. But one of his early works on nearness of money is also very often quoted in economics. In the last few years, he has been working on medical decision-making rules. And again, in that also, when in the US they brought out 50 best papers that doctors must read, his paper was included in that. Among the many qualities, I think I must mention that he loves his students and they are engaged in teaching and in research in very well-known places such as Harvard or London School. But I must mention just two names, two of his students who are very familiar to us. One is John Drich, and the other one is our own colleague, Professor Pradhan. The previous distinguished lecture that we had organized in March this year by James Sekman has also been a co-author of some of his papers, and thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation. I also take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Pranav Sen for having agreed to chair this session. He is chairman of the National Statistical Commission, and earlier he was the Chief Statistician of India and Secretary, Department of Ministry of Planning and Statistics. He also has taught in several places, including Johns Hopkins and the Delhi School of Economics. And for last 25 years or so, he has played a major role in economic policy formulation in the country, as well as in program monitoring process. Thank you, Dr. Sen, for accepting our invitation to chair this session. With these brief remarks, I will hand over the session to Dr. Sen to conduct.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. It gives me immense pleasure to be here chairing this public lecture by Professor Chetty. We go back a long way, but I think the most important was that in '94, when I joined the Planning Commission, I knew absolutely nothing about planning. I was completely clueless. I was a macroeconomist by training, so I knew macroeconomics, I knew growth theory, sort of, and absolutely nothing about planning. And so my immediate task was to hunt out people who were familiar with planning techniques and the theory of planning. And Professor Chetty was one of them. I spent a fair amount of time at the ISI learning from him. And then we lost touch for a long time. And it's such a pleasure to be back here with him. And frankly, having experienced what Professor Chetty can deliver, it would really be very unfair on my part to stand between you and what he has to say. So whatever I wish to say, I will say after Professor Chetty has delivered his address. And so without further ado, may I invite Professor Chetty to kindly give his address.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, Professor Panda and Professor Pradhan, and distinguished guests, it's really a great. It's really a great honor for me to be here to talk to you. I have in the past come to this hall many times to listen to distinguished lectures. I'm not quite sure that I will meet up to the standards of the speakers in the past, but I will try my best to say a few things that I know. In fact, when I got the invitation, suddenly a remark came to my mind A famous British scientist, Thomas Huxley, said, "A man of science past 60 does more harm than good." So then I was thinking that I am well past 60, I'm 76, and will I be able to do something, will I be able to say something that may be of some interest and useful? But then I also remembered two other famous British scientists, an exchange between father and son. Lord Raleigh and his son Raleigh, both are very famous scientists. So son asked father to comment on Huxley's remark. And father said, "That may be, if he undertakes to criticize the work of younger men. But I do not see why it need be so if he sticks to things he is conversant with." Okay. So I decided that I will talk about something with which I am familiar since a long time. In fact, I was very fortunate to have worked a long time ago when I was young with persons like Pradhan, Professor Panda, and many of my students at ISI. And I was in my 30s, they were in their 20s. So it was a great time, and I will talk a little bit about what I learned at that time, and I will also try to say what I have been thinking and working even in the last few weeks with Pradhan and a few others. Let me ask a basic question. Can markets promote growth and at the same time distribute incomes equitably? And I would like to start from a passage in Walras' Elements of Political Economy, I think, the famous book. There is a reference to a story. There is a deer in the forest, and some group of young men say, "It belongs to us. Without us, you cannot kill it." But then the older people say, "Look, young men, without us, you will not be in this world. So it also belongs to us." Okay. So probably a fair way to share is equally split. Okay. This is one theory of distribution. Now one can think of the marginal productivity theory of distribution, that is, pay according to the marginal contribution of the guy. But we also know with, for example, diminishing returns, you will not exhaust the product. So you'll be left with the surplus, and then who gets the surplus? So we separately need always some arbitrary rules for distributing goods. We do not have really a good theory of distribution. Okay, like markets cannot really distribute goods. Some arbitrariness is definitely there. Okay, so we'll start from that premise. Planning models without financial assets, okay, they are certainly very useful. Probably that's where you should start. Whether we have adequate real resources to meet the requirements. Can we grow efficiently using real resources? That's really checking for technical feasibility. Okay, without resources, we can as well stop. Okay, so resources, risk checking and planning, that real sector is absolutely important, no question about that. Okay, in fact, one of those statements in those days I used to hear from Professor Mahalanobis, my friends will say, any physically possible plan is financially feasible. Okay, so physical possibilities is very important, and finance, we can always find some ways. Okay, that question, will the finance ministry accept that statement? Will the RBI governor accept that statement? But it looks like now even the opposite is taking place. Like the finance ministry always, or the government probably almost says that we do not need planning commission. Okay, it's going to the other extreme now. Okay, now surprisingly, the famous growth models like Herod Domar and a few extensions of them, all of them do not have any financial asset, even though lot of them talk about it. Even in the last few months, there has been tremendous interest and publicity about from the book published by Thomas Piketty, okay, which is a lot to do with financial returns and concentration of wealth, things like that. Okay, so to talk about that what happens when we bring in finance, when we bring in markets, okay, what happens? That's what we should be looking at, and we certainly need some framework. Okay, what type of models we need? See, without, for example, time lags in this completely static, either instantaneous production or the production period is very long, we do not have to look into various things that go on. I borrow money from you, you return to me, and finally everything is settled. So the intermediate transactions all ignore it because the period is long enough. Either it's instantaneous production, you don't need any working capital, you don't need to borrow. So in these two extreme cases, you don't need financial assets. But I will argue in this talk, essentially for this type of approach to research, I say that we need a sequential or an adaptive approach. That is, we keep learning and revising. A sequential modeling we need. I also will argue that we need a strategic approach instead of assuming all the agents, all the participants are very passive. They will take whatever is coming, like the price they take and all that. Let's not assume. Let's also look into the possibility that people will act strategically in their interest. They will not take things as given. Okay, so that's the second thing I will argue. And the third one, I'll argue the type of research, it should be reproducible. That is, if I do something and present to you some evidence, you should be able to reproduce the same thing and get what I get. And that's feasible if, for example, we use only public data sets, public domain softwares, things like that. I'll talk about that. So with financial assets and time structure for production, we should look at these issues. And we should test the model using abundant, publicly available data, and that also I will talk about it today. Now, some of the things that I'll be talking is really goes back to a long time from the work that we did in ICSSR project with many distinguished students like John Dress, Shika Jha, Pradhan Ratha, Phil Scholtes, and Shanti Srinivasan, and so on. Okay. Now, there we started looking into time structure of production. That production takes time, there are lags. And we realized the need for financial markets, and credit policy and interest rate affect production and income distribution. Okay. Now, very briefly only I will talk. I will not bring in any algebra, but this is the only thing that I will use. So we would like to have a small macro model in which production takes time, and it is not simply a one good model like Herod Domar. We would like to have at least two goods, a consumption good and a capital good. Okay, so we need that. Okay, there will be a capital good, and since we assume it takes time to produce, producers may have to borrow. Therefore, there is a need for financial assets. We will say that there are bonds. Okay, markets in which you can borrow. And the simple model that we'll work with will have a consumption good with various production techniques like substitution possibilities in the consumption good alone. In the capital good, for simplicity, we will assume it's produced using labor. That's the type of model. So it has two goods, a financial asset, and there are markets. Okay, that's the setup in which we are going to look at the income generation and the growth process. Okay. All right. Some of the theoretical results that we have shown over the years is that if wages should be paid in advance in production, okay, you pay the wages to the workers when the process is going on. If that is to be done, steady growth is infeasible if capital is fully owned by the old. In a young and old, Samuelson's type of overlapping generations model, if the capital is completely owned by the old, we cannot advance the wages. We have demonstrated that. Okay, that's in a forthcoming paper with Pradhan and I have shown the aggregate supply curve for the consumption good has a backward bending segment. That means if you keep raising the price of the consumption good, like in an aggregate sense, beyond some level, the supply will start going down. Okay, okay, that's a type of theoretical result we have. Okay, and fixed capital and production lags create business cycles. We don't need other arguments. Simply fixed capital and a lag in production will create cyclical movements. You cannot avoid it. Like high profit rate can result in long-run unemployment in steady states when producers maximize profits. Producers are efficient. They are maximizing profits. They are in a long-run situation, but you can have long-run unemployment. We show that. Okay. Free markets may lead to suboptimal consumption. We want, okay, but what do we want? We want to maximize output per head. As a planner or as a government person looking after the interests of consumers, producers, everyone, what you want is maximum total output or maximum output per head or some type of, let's say, average product we want to maximize. Or I'm seeing some of the experts in total factor productivity like Professor K. L. Krishna and so on here. So say we want to maximize a productivity. Now, will a producer be interested in maximizing average product, or will he be interested in looking at the marginal product and make as much money as he can? Definitely, we have taught, we know, producers are interested in their welfare first, maybe afterwards for others. Okay, so if we expect them to maximize average product, no, we cannot. Okay, it may not happen. Okay, so it's not surprising at all. Okay, free markets therefore may lead to suboptimal outcomes. Okay, hence this is a conclusion. Theoretically, monetary and fiscal policies are needed to promote growth with equitable distribution. Without that, you cannot be sure. If it happens, it's just luck. Okay. All right. Now, I often try to distinguish over the years between two things, what I call the fancy part and the facts part. The fancies are, I can construct many mathematical models, theoretical models, and probably prove anything that I want by choosing certain assumptions and so on. So pure theory by itself is, at least in my opinion, is not of much value, and so that's why I call it fancy. Okay, Now, but here there are some interesting conclusions which I have already talked about. So I would like to just spend a minute to tell you about this particular backward bending aggregate supply curve. Okay, you see clearly that as you raise the price of the composite consumption good, supply could keep increasing, but at a point it starts turning. And that's an interesting point also. That's a point. See, price definitely depends upon clearly wage and interest rate and so on. So the interest rate, when it is at the natural rate, like the population growth rate, or if you take productivity into account, add that also. At that rate, you get the maximum supply. If you go above it, I would like to call, okay, like say, definitely Pradhan would certainly like to say that anything above that, that is like fair cost price. That is why I call it fair is you are allowing some rate of interest, time preference. You're okay. Some people may question, should you pay for time preference at all? Okay, but let's allow that a fair rate of interest. Beyond that, what you are getting, you call it profit, scarcity rent, things, whatever you want. Like beyond that, supply will, in our model, will start going down. In fact, Piketty has made a lot of argument about this. What's happening in the United States is an average rate of return should be probably about 4% or so, but it's reaching 6, 7, 8% and so on. And he's predicting that this is going to lead to a lot of trouble. Okay, that it's almost like the olden days you are going to have trouble. That's his prediction. So beyond certain rate, things will get worse, and our model exactly predicts that theoretically. Okay. Now this is about the end of the theory. Now I would like to go to the facts part. There, I will not claim that as an econometrician, I am going to give you a perfectly valid econometric analysis. Nowadays, I believe in a little different approach before I come to very final, very firm estimates and recommendations. With millions and billions of data available now, compared to, for example, in my PhD thesis, I used 13 observations, time series for US national income and so on, 13. But nowadays, my son Raj, as all of you will know, he works with 20 to 30 billion observations. Okay, so data are plenty. Okay, with plenty of data, you're practically looking at the population. Okay, and you can learn a lot straight from the data by looking at it in many ways, and also with tremendous softwares and so on, you can really visualize now. Later on, this time I'll tell you, even in 6 dimensions, you can nicely visualize and see patterns. So explore the data first for many suspicious relations. For example, here I'm saying that this type of phenomenon can take place. So I will look at the data for such things. That's what I'm going to do. Okay, with very extensive data, which we have put together in the last few months, and I have also made it accessible through our computing center. People were extremely nice to me to work with in the last few days. It's in their server, so anybody, as I said, reproducible research, public domain. So what all I have used is a public domain data set. All softwares are public domain, so it could be reproduced. Okay, we'll make everything available. It's there with Vinod and his colleagues. All right. Now let's start with, for example, this is an actual plot for data for 34 countries in this case. Okay, sometimes I go up to about 111 countries for a period of from 1960 to 2011. So in the x-axis I plot inflation rate. Okay, and in the y-axis I plot the growth rate of consumption goods. Growth rate. Notice as the inflation rate keeps going up to about 5%, it's like increase in the price, right? That is inflation. Keep increasing the price. Okay, the rate of growth of the consumption good is increasing. This is, as I said, it's a fact. That is actual data plotted. Okay, it keeps going up, but beyond certain range, like after 5%, it starts going down. That's what I was arguing. There could be a backward bending segment. Okay, this appears to be some type of evidence from real data. Okay, right. Now I'll show you a few graphs like that on next one. All right. Again, finance ministry, Reserve Bank governor, and so on. Now, this again is the average bank credit and real GDP growth rates. And the data is for 1950 to 2011. 40 countries we could get. It's adjusted for many country-specific things like human capital, labor, capital growth, etc. Adjusted for that using regression methods. Then, if you plot that, you see as a bank private sector credit growth rate, it increases. For a while, it's very conducive for growth. But after a while, something like in this case, it takes about 10% or 12%, it starts going down. It may even start hurting. Okay, this again is from actual data plotted. Okay. Now here is it's again another beautiful data set publicly available. That's called SWID, Standardized World Income Inequality Data Set, made available from a person in University of Iowa, I think, right? There you can get a Gini index, okay, for this is for 111 countries for the period 1950 to 2011. Now the curve on the top, red curve called the market curve. He calls it market because if you don't interfere in any way, okay, like putting income tax on the rich and giving it to the poor, okay, so that type of redistributive income tax policies, okay, if you do that, he calls it net. So the market is something that you don't do anything. Let the market completely function, minimum. You see clearly that in the initial stage a little bit, that's called the, I guess the Quizlets, like inequality may go up for a while, okay, and then it starts going down. But definitely with public policies, the blue line, it significantly comes down. So that public policy is indeed effective and I would say needed. Okay, this again, okay, from actual data. Okay. Now with the limited data that is there, again I plotted also for India. You can see not much, but this may be due to a lot of reasons. I mean, you cannot simply use for each country the same technique because for standardized way, only income tax adjustment is taken into account. But I know very well, even from the title of the ICSSR grant we had in those days, our title was Price and Distribution Controls in the Indian Economy. So our public policies involve not just income tax, so many other things. Unless you take that into account, you cannot look at the effect of the public policies. Okay, right. So, but it shows something. Still, the blue line is a little low, but it's not as much. Okay, right. This again, I love this graph. All right, inequality is there. Okay, and let's say growth by itself may not equally distribute. What can we do? Again, this, for instance, for 111 countries for this period of 1950 to 2011, beautifully, with when the average years of schooling increases, Gini index very nicely comes down. So as one of the policy measures, or one of the areas in which you should invest a lot is in education. Okay, definitely. Okay, right. Now this is for this actually here I am even giving the actual data. The points are actually actual, and the curve is just drawn through that. Look at, for example, United States. Okay, you can see clearly since the nearly something like late 70s, 80s, even the policy is such that it's increasing inequality. Okay, it's the blue curve is going up, even though it is less than the red one without any intervention, without public policy. But this is just going up. And here I am plotting both the Gini index and the education. Notice that education in United States, education index, nearly late 70s and 80s, it's almost stabilized. The growth rate is not there. So that's many people in the US agree that that's probably one of the reasons why there is a lot of trouble now. Okay. Now this again, okay. So this is again, like started with the Berkeley economist Emmanuel Seitz, the top 1% getting lots of percentage of the GNP. Okay, so if the top 10% share increases, let's say from 10%, 20%, 30%, and so on, what happens to consumption? What happens to employment and investment? Okay, notice that even consumption for a while, one Kaldorian hypothesis, you may think that when the rich have more of it, they will save and they will not consume. But here, the empirical evidence does not fully support that. For a while, they even start consuming. We do not know what they consume, and we suspect that it may be a lot more like gold, or even various ways, like one of our Massachusetts previous governors. He has all his money, most of it in Cayman Islands. Okay, so so that type of consumption may be there, but notice that this is reduction that I am plotting on the y-axis. So as the concentration of wealth increases, the reduction in employment increases. Okay, that's what's happening. So less and less employment if wealth gets concentrated. Okay, and investment is practically flat. Give more money to the rich, they will save more and invest. There does not seem to be much support for that type of thing. Okay. All right. Now, in terms of future research ideas, some of them that I have, okay, I have for statistical models in general, okay, I would like to argue this way. Lot of initial statistical techniques were developed for physical sciences, okay, or at most agricultural sciences and so on. But let's start with physical sciences. The errors that take place in physical experiments in physics, they are all experimental errors. Okay, it's quite okay to assume that they are symmetrically distributed. It's quite all right to assume that they are random. Okay, now one of the first things that I started working in a medical school years ago is that the doctors make errors. Of course, many of you may not know, because doctors are trained to be very confident. Okay, in my family there are many doctors, and it makes sense. You go to a doctor, and if he or she tells you, I'm not quite sure, but I can do something for you, you won't like that. You would like a doctor, I know for certain, take this, it will work. They are trained to be confident. Okay. Now, so they make lots of errors. Okay, and I can even tell you a very. I give talk. I used to give talks. This is the first time I'm now giving a talk in economics. But I used to give many talks in when I visited India in medical centers, and one of the places several endocrinologists were sitting, and the director was sitting next to me. He said, if any of you suspect that you may have diabetes, you have two options. I'm an economist. You can come to me. Or you can go to Dr. Mohan. I think he's also a former Prime Minister's physician. Okay. You can go to Dr. Mohan. What I will do is toss a coin. Heads, you have diabetes. Tails, no. Okay. And if you really have diabetes, 50% I will be right, and 50% I will be wrong. So I have an accuracy of 50%. I said, go to Dr. Mohan, he will conduct many tests. His accuracy is 47%. Okay. I quoted from American Diabetes Association statistics. Okay. That's understandable because for various reasons, because the how the statistics comes is based on some 3,000 Pima Indians in Arizona. Okay, why they were chosen? 50% of them very high diabetes incidence. So to determine some criterion for who is diabetic, that's the basis even today for using 126 milligrams of fasting plasma glucose even today. Okay, so medical things, lots of errors and so on, false positive, false negative, and so on. So I realized that errors are not randomly made. Errors sometimes are purposely made to your benefit. A false positive, ordering an X-ray unnecessary, I mean, somewhat protects the doctor against liabilities, and he also makes money on the way or hospital. So here, and I used to say that in a meeting when we introduce ourselves, each one will introduce what they are doing, and I will often say, I'm trying my best to find some good errors in this department, in the medical department, good errors, because some errors are good and some errors are bad. So errors are made systematically sometimes. So therefore, in human social sciences, when we build statistical models, we should recognize that the errors may not be random at all. With lots of data, with fantastic contributions from non-parametric statisticians and so on, we have methods to look at the data and figure out even some systematic components and things like that. So recognize that errors are not random. I think I would like to build that in. Estimate relations between, I would also say, so we'll be adaptive. That is, we will assume that this is probably the error structure. We will look at it, and if it is not, we will then adaptively change that. Okay, we assume maybe it's a Gaussian distribution to start with. We notice, no, it has a long tail. Let's adjust it. So keep doing that. That's what I mean by sequential. And I will say strategic, because in a simple game, if I have to formulate, I will take, say, the government and the business. And the third group, consumers, passive, leave them alone, okay, for a while. Government plays a game with the business people. Or another very interesting game I would like to study is the center plays a game. The center and the states, not one, it's not one person alone playing. Center and the state, they are playing games in the finance commission allocation of the things and so on. View it as a game problem, not as a very passive or a market type of thing. Okay, that's one thing. So estimate relations between policies. Okay, it's always, it may sound like it's impossible. It is true that Governor Rajan and his team will set some repo rate or change. They can record it, and then they hope something will happen. That also could be at least recorded secretly, and see whether you are achieving it. If not, keep revising it. Okay, you may not be perfect, but you will do much better than keeping everything only in your head or in an ad hoc fashion. So that's one thing you can definitely do. Okay. Then, so this is for the Indian case, particularly indirect taxes, public distribution, all those things. When you study inequality, you have to take that into account. Okay. And I will also say that you should, see, a very nice setup is the repeated games. Governments live forever, business people live forever, we can assume, okay? Then, in olden days, in game theory, what all they could show was inefficiency, national, like prisoner's dilemma. But when you play the game repeatedly, you can sometimes indicate, it's possible, that by giving a public signal, and if you misbehave, I have the stick. Or if you well behave, I also will give you reward. Okay? So when you are going to play the game for a long time, people will be interested in learning and they will play a better game. Or there are results to show that any Pareto improving outcome could be sustained as a game theoretic. We can create incentives and it can be played as a game. That is, and that used to be one of my approaches to, if there is a problem, okay, and if there is a solution, it should be an improvement. That's why it's called a solution. Then, compared to the first best, which some economists will do, like one of the great advices that when I first came to India as a very, very young person after PhD, just after PhD, the finance minister at that time, C. Subramaniam, gave me an advice. Young man, do not repeat many of the academic guys do, that they come and tell exactly to do the first best. Okay, but first best we may not be able to do. You do not know. So what I recommend to you is, give us a few alternatives. Alternative 1, this may happen. Alternative 2, this may happen, and so on. We know the pulse of the people. We can select, but you do not know. Okay, so you see, you can rank. You know, like it's here. So right, in repeated games, you see, we can do those things. Okay, so that's one suggestion that I have. Okay. Okay. Use this is what, yeah. Use, so finally, again to come.
Till 7:15. Well, friends, I think we've been given a glimpse into the possibilities that Professor Chetty is exploring. And I'm sure, I don't know about you, but I certainly have a lot of questions, but I'm sure all of you do as well. The organizers have told me that we have about 20 minutes available for questions and answers, and perhaps even for some discussion. And I'm sure that if the pressure comes on, we can prevail upon him to extend the time as well. So I will weigh in a little later, so I open it to the floor now. If anybody has any questions, observations, or would like to indeed initiate a discussion with Professor Chetty, we'd be happy to consider.
Thank you, Professor Chetty, for this interesting talk. So I'd first of all like to convey to you that I'm very glad to be seeing the names of some of my professors here, including Professor Panda. So my question to you is regarding the role of teaching neoclassical economics today, after having seen the problems with market failures or of like the financial crisis, and in the Indian context particularly, this political force that kind of tries to do away with the need for planning as a kind of rhetoric. So my question to you is, how far do you think like young students today should be continued to be taught neoclassical economics without having the caveats in place? And whether are we not falling into the trap again and again and not learning from our mistakes in the past? Thank you.
I think that neoclassical economics is it's a lot of time has gone into development and a lot of people have worked on it and so on. So I would not say that we should not learn at all, but definitely yes, we should learn, and I'm sure that many of the professors also teach by clearly pointing out the limitations, and so I think that's the way to look at it. It's
Mike, please.
Professor Calder had a long article on alternative theory of income distribution. Do you have anything to relate to your work?
actually, I didn't get the question. Calder has a theory of distribution.
That's right. Alternative theory of distribution.
Yeah, right.
Rather than the marginal.
Right. Yes. Like you see, yeah, he will. I think one of his basic kind of assumptions or statements is that the rich save and the poor spend and so on. But that doesn't seem to be that much true anymore. Not that much. Yes. That's not enough of a distribution theory. I think it might have been okay during those days, but not now.
But you are talking of personal income distribution. When you initially talked about average product and marginal product, so that is factorial distribution. Are we mixing up these two?
Mixing up what?
Size distribution and the factor of shares.
No, I don't think so. That I was just pointing out that the objectives of producers are very different from the objectives of planners or policy makers. That's all I was saying. So no inconsistency there, I don't think.
Thank you, sir, for that excellent presentation. Just two comments, not questions. One is that, sir, you are pushing for, it seems to me you are pushing for public policy in order to attain social welfare in terms of lower inequality, etc. This debate on this is not so much on whether it's something that we need to have. I think that is something that everybody agrees, but whether we can sustain that. Public policy is expensive. Poor countries have limited capacity for getting tax revenues, and so whether they can actually sustain that in the long run is another question that you have to deal with. Secondly, a lot of public policy tries to decrease inequality, not through creation of employment, but through transfers. We have examples in India, which again are very short term, which will show up in terms of lower inequality. But again, the questions of sustainability of that inequality is in question in the longer run. So I would suggest that a more, taking these factors into account, any kind of policy conclusion about the usefulness of public policy needs to be looked into for inequality. The second comment is about your empirical approach. Sir, going along with what you have said, I think there's an alternative approach which is Bayesian econometrics, which actually does not start with any of the assumptions of classical econometrics of normality of error, behavior, etc., but would give you standard estimation results. Thank you.
Thank you very much. They are excellent comments, certainly. Maybe I'll answer the simplest question first. When I said the sequential analysis, that's exactly Bayesian approach, right? That's so. I'm all for Bayesian. In fact, my PhD thesis was on Bayesian analysis of econometric models. So yes, I definitely agree with that. Sequential analysis is always Bayesian. Okay. Now, about the first question, whether public policies are sustainable, okay? Definitely, we should not plan on or think that forever we are going to have a lot of public policy. So some public policy may always be needed, okay? Because like, for example, business cycles, they are always there, and some things, so you may have to do, like the central banks will always exist. But minimal public policies must be there. So when you say, I understand it as public policy is not sustainable, like for example, we try to distribute the sugar through ration shops. So that's a public policy. We should not plan on such type of long-term things. That gradually, by increasing the supply and various things, even inequality, initially probably you can redistribute income tax and all, but that cannot be a long-term strategy. Long-term strategy, as I was showing, education, things like that, okay, health, and that you should plan. So sustainability, that's what I would say. And your second, now I forget your second, that's relating to, I think it's yes. I think I answered that also, right? Yeah, education, that type of thing will work.
सॉरी सर, मतलब जो मेरा जो क्वेश्चन है वो इस तरह का है कि वी हैव created the infrastructure in a quantitative way, but in the Indian context we are losing the quality aspect. Suppose in education sector we have opened the number of schools in multiple schemes under Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan. Earlier education sector program, multiple schemes are run, but the qualitative aspect, when the outcome say that the reducing enrollment is reducing in government sector, but the private sector schools is open, our school education policy is liberalized, but the number of enrollment in the government sector schools is reducing, and on the other hand the private sector school is high. What steps should be taken in our economy?
I guess you are talking about quality of education, for instance, and all types of educational schemes are there, or degrees are offered, and so on. So how to regulate, what to do about that, okay? This again, like it depends, like so many engineering colleges, even in some I have seen in the south, at least some time ago, when there is a demand for certain type of thing, some supply comes up, okay? And I will be a little more careful. I will not try to intervene in everything, but there probably I may rely on naturally things may, like how long such very mediocre quality institutions survive. Okay, so I will not try to get into that type of regulations and so on.
Similarly, it is happening in the health sector also. We have introduced the National Rural Health Mission and Health Mission, National Health Mission also, and we have created a number of dispensaries and created all of infrastructure, medicines and all, etc. But there is lack of shortage of doctors, and they are lacking behind. The private hospitals are growing up day to day.
No, I mean, I think the issue that is being raised, and it's an interesting question if you think about it, Professor Chetty. What he's asking is the following: is that if I actually roll out public services to attain the objectives that you have been talking about, which is increased education, increased health, and so on. But in the process of rolling out, the average quality actually goes down. Then the net effect may actually be very ambiguous. Right. Right? Now, if it is ambiguous, how do you tackle it in your...
Right. That's a very good question. One should be definitely concerned about that. Like, how do we intervene, right? Like, definitely, I think in those days, one of the criticisms was we were interfering, we were intervening, trying to regulate a lot. Okay. Now, that may be difficult to do, okay, but then coming back to, like, for instance, sure, like even in, at least in the last several years, I'm a little more familiar with some of US problems. Even the quality of meat is very carefully studied and rated and so on, and okay, but certain, like, see, for example, quality of health services, that's still a very big problem that doctors would not even like to be somewhat evaluated. Okay, so public. Okay, I will, as far as possible, I will try to minimize the public production of these services, and in the initial stages you may need. Then, when private services are being offered, private, okay, then how to make sure quality is there? I think that's the question that's being asked. Or to give a simple example, even in the US context, higher education is becoming extremely expensive in US. Okay, like,
if I might interject, just the other day I was reading that in the US the concern is that although the average years of schooling are going up, the quality of education in the schools is going down, and the net effect may be that the overall level of human capital may be lower than what it was 10 years ago. Right? And this is a concern, and it's a legitimate concern.
Right. Definitely, you see, like in an open society, these things will come up. The education, for example, I can quote with a concrete example how this type of quality problem in US. And it so happens that my son Raj was involved in this, that once he published a study showing that 1 year of exposure to a good teacher, even at the 4th grade level, contributes almost throughout life, and even does things like reducing teenage pregnancy. Okay, and he had a quantitative estimate of the contribution of a teacher, like $250,000, and which President Obama quoted in his State of the Union address. Okay, then what happened was, in California, 9 children cited Raj's study and went to California Superior Court, and they said, as a constitutional right, we as children deserve good teachers. And but we are being sent, the teachers, they are from a minority neighborhood. Teachers who fail in other neighborhoods are sent here, things like that. And so a big lawyer team, they took it up, and Raj testified 2 days. And then the judge gave a statement. The evidence Raj presented shocks conscience. And so the main problem there was in that particular, I don't know, in that state, I think, yeah, California state. The law was within 16 months of hiring a teacher, the teacher should be given tenure or fired. A decision within 16 months, 18 months. That's too short a period, and whereas many other states have 5 years, things like that. So now it's many states, children lawyers are all suing. It's going on now. So there are problems, and the quality goes down, and like this tenure law. is a bad law. Okay, so you have to deal with it. Like the courts are there, and so yeah, I think so. You have to. It's very difficult to figure out to start with a perfect law. You have to experiment sequentially. If you are an open society and if the general interest dominates, I think the main problem will be a small group of people either making laws, okay, or governing this, that. If that is the case, there are problems, vested interests. But otherwise, in an open, more and more open society, these problems, I think, can be handled by public discussions and changing legislations and so on. That will be my response.
Since this question is on the quality of education and role of education. And one of slides really clearly showed that higher education also probably has relatively much better impact on the distribution part. Now, firstly, I'm really puzzled whether this is causing that causality, kind of problem, whether it is distribution which is really causing, better education, or education which is causing distribution. That is one thing. Just now you said, that if you were better education, then probably teenage pregnancy will also be, because we listen to all these kind of arguments in Planning Commission and Ministry of Health also. And they're quite quite integrated with that. Basically, they say, oh, you should integrate your population policy with the development policy, this economic policy, or population policy, and within population, you've got all kind of parameters. Teenage pregnancy is one thing which you said. So what I say, because there was a lot of discussion in Vigyan Bhavan, including poverty, education, teenage pregnancy, age at marriage, take up all kind of indicators, they are quite linked with each other. And you really do not know across states what is happening and what kind of combinations are working in which places. So the role of education, when I say the question would be now, that the kind of policy pronouncement which you are getting in Planning Commission and other also Ministry of Health, that you should integrate your population policy with the development policy. Which component of development is going to have impact?
Yeah, sure.
Right? It's very difficult to judge.
Yes.
So what the empirical evidences or experience for India, you can let us know. Is it the social development? Is it education? Is it health? Is it sanitation? Whatever it is, that can bring better results for India.
I totally agree with you that what I presented is more correlation, and you cannot call it always causation. But with plenty of data, it's sometimes possible. You have to be imaginative, and it's possible to tease out causal relationships. It's possible, okay? And I used to have argument with my son even on this. But for example, the causal relationship he established with teachers was by this idea that take women teachers. Okay, we have to have, like said, we have to conduct an experiment. Okay, two groups, one group has good teacher, another group does not, and you cannot assign that. You cannot design that experiment. But you see, we in statistics very often, okay, we view as if we are playing a game with God. Okay, but I was arguing that we are playing a game with businessmen. But when God plays game or nature plays game, then it's nice and we can make use of it. Okay. In his data set, he found number of women teachers got pregnant. Okay, and then that year alone they were substituted. That is a random event. Okay, some classes did not substitute and some this, and then so you cannot deny that it's a random allocation. And so like that you can do, but you cannot always do this. But I have another suggestion. This is what I think we should do, which I'm even talking to my son Raj and others also. See, in economics, in social sciences, you cannot rely all the time on experimentation. It's not possible because even while you are experimenting, things change. But we can do one thing. Whatever we are doing, keep a clear record, what you plan to, what you hope to get, okay, and learn from that, keep sequentially. For example, you can experiment initially, like as they do in agriculture and so on a small plot. Like here, in a small region, you first experiment with that. Often we do that in social sciences. You cannot, you don't have enough resources to go on a national scale. So do that, keep record, learn from it, and then keep improving on it. That we can always do, okay? But nowhere we can, you see, we are dealing with human beings, and therefore it's not even meaningful to think that we will discover truth. And I will even argue there is nothing like truth in social sciences, even maybe in physics. Okay, even some people even doubt that, but physics and chemistry, but not in biological organisms, and there it's a statistical truth. That's all we should aim for.
Sir, I would like to know about the reason for the downward portion of the bank credit growth.
It's a very good question. You see, as I was telling, that as the price keeps going up, okay, the price says what are the various components? Wage component, the interest rate component, okay, and then probably other scarcity component, okay. Imagine the real rate of interest keeps going up, and I argued that time structure of production is important. It takes time to produce. There is working capital. You borrow money. The higher the rate of interest, you have to pay more. Okay? So the rate of interest affects in many ways. At high rate, we were very pleased when we got that result. Both at high rates of interest and at low rates of interest, you will have unemployment long term. Okay? At high rates of interest, what happens? So the cost of everything goes up. Even wages you have to advance. Okay? So, and at the same time, the income distribution may not be adequate to create the demand, because I think that's essentially Piketty's argument also. The interest income doesn't get spent on normal consumption goods. So interest keeps going up. That type of wealth concentration takes place. And it is then in the interest of the producers not to produce much. And if at all bid in land or gold. Okay, so that's the reason why. And with low rate of interest, again, a lot of unemployment may happen, because with low rate of interest, you will substitute more by capital intensive techniques. So both cases. So it's a delicate business, right rate of interest. And like I had a meeting with Governor Rajan a few days ago. He definitely has a huge responsibility, I would think, in conjunction with the in cooperation with the finance ministry and so on, how to set these rates.
Professor Chetty, you talked both about the Kuznets curve and about Piketty's work. And it's one of the things that is interesting is that, think of what Kuznets curve was saying. It is saying that as income grows, you're going to get the income distribution first worsening and then improving. And now the later evidence suggests it starts worsening again at a higher point in time. But Piketty's work is more interesting, and it seems to suggest, at least my readings, it seemed to suggest, that even in a stationary state, you can get income distributions worsening.
I completely agree with you.
Now that is an interesting. How do you sort of square that?
Yeah, my argument will be, or my response will be, see, people play games. So even in a static setup, even in one-time thing, it depends upon what your strategy is, and So you play the game.
And you're saying it's an unbalanced game.
Right. It's an unbalanced game. And I think giving up power
That's not.
it's not an easy thing. Right.
Anyone else? Well, we have exceeded our time by 5 minutes, and let me express my gratitude to Professor Chetty for the wonderful presentation and to all of you for the subsequent discussion. And I would now like to invite Dr. Vasant Pradhan to give the vote of thanks.
Actually, when I listened to Professor Chetty, I went back in my mind more than in 20 years in time, and we used to listen to his lectures, and it was with utmost clarity. So I don't think anything has changed. Today we also, your lecture was as clear as it can be. So, we also say that you taught us how to think clearly, very complicated problems. You will reduce it to a very, very simple system and then analyze. Today I was looking at your email, and Professor Kaushik Basu sent me a mail saying that you taught us how to think clearly. So, thank you very much, sir, for coming and accepting our invitation to give this lecture. We learned a lot. I also would like to thank Dr. Pranam Seth for chairing this session. At the end, I would like to thank all of you, the distinguished audience. Thank you.
Please join us for food.